that value in the presentation. So now we're going to go over how to do the very first sketchbook activity. All right, we talked about value. It's the lightness of and darkness of one color. And so always the first thing you should consider doing is making a value scale to identify those colors. So that is the first thing that I'm going to do here. I am going to use a ruler, but it's not necessary. Just want to make mine nice and neat. Okay, so I'm just going to use 2 lines, not necessarily measuring it, just using it for straight lines. All right, and I'm going to go ahead and break it up into 5 squares there. All right, so we know light to dark. So always, you don't always have to do this, but for me it just makes sense to know that I'm going to go from the left to my right and go light to dark. All right, now to do that, basically with using pencil, it's just a matter of pressure. So I go from barely pressing down to pressing down. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave this one white. Okay, so when we talk about our spheres in a moment, the lightest value on our value scale, I'm just going to leave. So I'm going to start here, and I'm barely pushing my pencil to paper. Okay, and then as I go to the next square, I'm just going to press it a little bit harder. Just like that. Okay, then as I go to the next one, I'm pressing a little bit harder. Okay, all in just how hard I'm pressing to the paper. And then, of course, I'm pressing pretty hard for this last square. And I could probably even go darker, and we'll talk about that when we do the shadow. And if you want to blend a little bit, your fingers, always good for kind of blending those. All right, so now I've got my value scale from my lightest light, which is basically nothing, all the way to my dark. So when we talked about shape and form, we talked about turning a circle into a sphere. And how do we do that? Well, we do that with shading. So, but before we do that, we have to identify where we're shading and what we're shading, all right? So I'm lightly going to draw my little circle here. And I've got my value scale to help me know how dark my colors want to go, okay? Not a very good circle, but kind of doing it as on an angle. So if I were to get in front of it, maybe it would be a little better. All right, the first thing, when we talk about value, it's usually light and shadow. We have to know where the light is hitting something, where it's not. So to do that, when we're drawing, we identify a light source. So I'm just going to zoom in a little bit. I'm just going to say that my light source is over here. So I'm just going to identify it by drawing a little sun. And it's going to hit my sphere right there. All right? So once I know that, then I'm going to divide my sphere into 4 parts, okay? These 4 parts are going to help me identify what to color on my sphere. So the first one is where the light is actually hitting my object, and that is called a highlight. All right. Secondly, the part kind of in between where the light's kind of hitting it, but it's starting to get a little darker, that part is called midtones. And then lastly, over here is not getting very much light at all, is it? So this one is called our shadow. And I said we are going to have 4 parts. So the last one is called a cast shadow. If I am standing and the light is hitting me this way, behind me, my body is casting a shadow on the ground. Same thing here. Our sphere is going to cast a shadow on the ground. So we call that the cast shadow. So now, because I've identified the light source, I know that I have 4 parts of my sphere. And because I have done a value scale, I know what colors to color those or shade those. So my highlight for now, okay, you want to say right where that light hits is going to be this one right here. Like no shading at all. So I'm just going to pick a small part right here. But then around that, I'm going to start with my second box. So Always, guys, always a regular pencil shades, okay? Mechanical pencils do not, all right? So then I'm just, as I move towards my midtones, those are like those middle areas. As I move closer to the shadow, I'm just going to gradually get a little darker. And don't worry, we can blend this out. Gradually get a little darker. And how am I doing that? By pressing more pressure on the paper. All right. And then so I've used probably about 3 of those tones. So now for my shadow, what do I need to do? Yeah, that's where I'm going to press my darkest. So, and I'm pressing pretty hard to get a little closer. All right. Now, this is where I was saying I probably could go a little bit darker. So for my cast shadow, I'm actually now using the tip of my pencil because I really want to make that dark. So I'm using a very soft graphite. It's my favorite pencil to draw and shade with, ones we have here in the classroom. All right, there's my cast shadow. Now, what I can do here is I can use my little, to make sure that's bright white. And then if I want to blend them together, you have the best blending tool of all, which is your finger. All right. And then I can always go in, if I want to just make this a little darker on the outside, I can touch up some things. But now I have my finished sphere. Okay. So we have our highlight, which is right here. We have our midtones, which I would say these are our 3 midtones. And then we have our shadow and then our cast shadow. Okay. So in the sketchbook activity, I said that you had to have a value scale and 3 spheres. So now I'm going to show you what the other 2 spheres are going to look like. And we learned about this when we talked about line. If you can remember that we talked about hatching and cross hatching, okay? So those are lines that we can use, and they're also ways that we can add value to something, all right? So let's just say, and you don't necessarily have to do this, but let me draw another little value scale. I won't make it as big. But if I am doing a hatching value scale, all right, hatching, remember, are lines that go in one direction. All right, so maybe here I leave it blank, and maybe here I'm light and kind of far apart, and I'm getting a little bit darker. A little bit darker here. And also, what do you see happening? I'm also getting closer together. So you can add value just by putting your lines closer together. All right, so same thing. Let's identify our light source. And let's say it's hitting right in the middle. So I'm going to divide them up. So I've got my highlights, my midtones, and then all right here would be my shadow. Now, the light source is hitting right in the center, so I feel like my cast shadow is going to be right behind me right there. All right, so same thing, but instead of shading, we're now going to use hatching. So I'm going to leave right here white, but I'm going to use a very light hatching here. And as I move around, I might press a little harder. But as I'm pressing harder, I also want to consider getting closer together. All right, let me go all the way around because my shadow is kind of all the way around. I'm going to add some more in here. Okay, so I'm pressing, but what else am I doing? Closer together. All right, so this would be your hatching sphere. All right, and then same thing with my cast shadow. All right, the next one is going to be our cross hatching. So same thing. I'm going to say that my light source is hitting over here. So I've got my highlight, midtone, shadow, cast shadow. But cross hatching, we know, is just simply crossing it. And if you want to do another value scale, you can do that as well. So I'm going to leave this very light here. Just go around that highlight spot. And as I move out, my pressure is going to get a little harder. And also I might consider getting a little close together. Sometimes it looks like little tic-tac-toe boards, right? Okay, and then as I apply, I get closer to the shadow. You can see that my pencil gets darker and closer together. And you can still blend up, doesn't have to be super separated. And then my cast shadow. All right, so this is what you're going to need for sketchbook activity number 1. At least one value scale, and then you're going to have 3 spheres, one done with shading, one hatching, and one cross hatching.